Hi, I'm Tammy from TLD Design Center and Gallery. Welcome to my video. I have started a series of videos that are focused on different weaving looms, different models, different makers and different models. Today's video is focused on rather a unicorn of a loom in the Norwood manufacturing line. This happens to be a very vintage Norwood, as you maybe can see, hopefully can see, by the brass tag on it, that this one actually was made in Chicago. And in fact, it was only for a few short years that the looms were made here before the company manufactured out of Michigan. So people kind of, rarely see these. They're so old. And so, yeah, so I started these videos. I've been teaching here in the Chicago area. I've been buying looms, refurbishing them, teaching new students on them for over 27 years now. And so I've seen a lot of different manufacturers and models of looms through here over those years, and some repairs I've had to make, and some little bit of a hack for the loom maybe, to make the loom function better. And indeed this loom I have had to tweak it a little bit. But the other thing that I'm doing is focusing on front to back loom dressing. This isn't a video to teach you how to do front to back loom dressing. It's really rather to offer a suggestion that if you own or are considering buying one of these vintage Norwood looms, how you could do the front to back loom dressing method on it. So this loom is actually already, the huddles are already threaded and the reed is already slayed. And this is one of my weaving students' projects. She owns a loom herself, but her loom isn't wide enough to do the blanket project that she wanted to do. So she signed up to rent, essentially, to take a class here to weave that blanket on this loom, which is a 49-inch threadable. It's promoted as a 50-inch, but in fact, the spacing on it is actually 49. If you were to take a tape measure and measure the true threadable width of your loom, it's really the inside measurement of the shaft. So this is the shafts of the loom. The loom loves straight paths for your threads. Your edge threads will be happier, won't be as prone to fray if you honor the straight path of the loom. Just because the loom maybe can accommodate a reed and or possibly was sold with a reed that extends beyond the width, the inside width of those shafts, be careful about that, because it really does put a different tension on those edge threads, which could be problematic and cause them to be prone to shredding. So the best job you can do of honoring a straight path on any loom, not just this Norwood, is really the best choice when you're setting up your projects. So this is I'm gonna simultaneously talk about front to back loom dressing, but then also point out little hacks or tricks or things that I have modified perhaps on this particular loom. And so I'm gonna start by showing you the front of the loom here. Now you can see that there is a white shelf board spanning the distance between the shuttle race, which is the little shelf that is where your shuttle will slide across, the shuttle race, and the brass beam, the front beam. So I just go to IKEA and go to their as-is department and purchase. They have cabinet doors. Since this loom really does measure more like 50-something inches, this is a very long board that I have. And it could be a little deeper than that distance between the breast beam and the shuttle race, but you want to be a little bit careful about how much deeper it really is, because personally I'm prone to accidentally forget, and I lean on the edge of the board and flip it. So it's probably wise not to have your board extend too much past the breast beam. So as you can see, the reed is already slayed. Here are her warp chains. Because her project is so wide, she measured her warp on a warping board and has multiple chains. The method of slaying that she opted for was not one that I'm typically teaching people in my studio and myself. I typically will take the reed off of the loom and bring it to a table and insert leash sticks into the cross and sit comfortably at the table slaying my reed, where the table is able to support all the threads. She experimented with the front to back method illustrated in Deb Chandler's book, Learning to Weave, in which case she was holding her cross in her hand, sitting at the loom, and we secured she did not have the shelf board on it while she was doing it, and we secured the reed, the beater bar, into a mid position by using stretchy bands made out of t-shirts. So we would just slice up a t-shirt and pull them till they're like a little rope, and that way we have a soft band that won't mar the loom, that will be able to have a little bit of give in it and easy to tie and untie. So she did sit. Now, she did encounter a little bit of an issue with this method. The issue that came up for her was that she had accidentally made an error in her stripes. Because she had multiple chains, she actually, sitting here at the loom, didn't notice that she had put the wrong color stripe in the wrong location until she had already slayed the reed, in which case she no longer had her cross to refer to. So I do kind of propose that perhaps having the leash sticks and the reed on the table, you are sliding your warp chains onto the leash sticks. Perhaps she would have noticed this error prior to slaying the reed. In the event that she didn't, she would still have leash sticks preserving her cross, and then she could have just easily, way more easily, pulled the threads out of the reed when she did discover the error, and the cross was still there to guide her. Nonetheless, she is now successfully threaded, slayed, and but there is no longer leash sticks here. A typical front to back loom dressing for my studio would be that leash sticks would still be here if you did it at the table and then moved it onto the loom for the next step, which of course is threading the huddles. So this pertains to this Norwood loom specifically. As you can see, this loom has what is known as a sectional warp beam on it. There is some confusion out there about sectional warp beams and whether or not you can still do front to back or even back to front loom dressing if you have a sectional beam. Sectional beam is not mutually exclusive. Just because you have one doesn't mean that you must set it up with a sectional equipment, which would include a spool rack and a tension box. And so the alteration that needed to happen for this Norwood loom, though, was the conversion to an apron rod here. So I replaced, usually when I encounter a Norwood whose previous owner, because these aren't being made any longer, these are all going to be in the used marketplace, might have a tie string positioned in every 2-inch section. Now I'm missing some of my pins, my dowels, because this is so old and the glue has dried. So some of them have fallen out, some of them I have, some of them weren't there when I bought this loom from its previous owner, and she was at the very least the second owner, not the first. At any rate, there are too many ties when you are converting it to a front to back or even back to front loom dressing method. So I took off all of those individual ties and replaced it with a rod, metal rod in this case, but a wood rod. Wood rods, depending on the thickness, you got to watch out, because this loom, the span of this loom of 49 inches, you do have to watch out how thin the rod is, the tie-on rod or the apron rod that you're going to use, so that when you're doing narrower projects, that it actually doesn't, like, concern on this one is that it bends if it's too narrow. At any rate, I use mini blind or curtain rod string, and it's a nylon, so it's a non-stretch. It's durable for accepting the action of mini blinds being lifted and lowered and operated, as well as curtains, and so we know that it is certainly a durable material for replacing this part of the loom. And the only thing I do is I will use a match or a lighter, and I will melt the ends so that it doesn't unravel and get frayed, although I'm looking at this loom and I haven't done that yet. So I will do that though eventually. So this is a sectional beam, but we are doing front to back loom dressing on it. The other consideration for, and this is true of the newer Norwoods also, is that it's really not designed as a removable back beam. However, I find that we can use it that way. As you can see, I have the bolt on this loom already unscrewed all the way. I am actually going to end up replacing this with a shorter, I don't need it to be this long, as long as you don't mind that you maybe aren't using all original aged to perfection screws, this black color, this oxidized version of it. At any rate, inside here you see there is a nut, and it's rather stuck in this opening. And so I've identified over the years of working with Norwood looms that I can use this as a removable back beam after all. And so, like I said, I'm going to replace these with a little bit shorter things so that it's not sticking up like this. I can actually screw it back down into this nut when I begin weaving. But because we're not applying any pressure on the loom when we are threading the loom, and this is for the threading only, because with front to back loom dressing, you sit behind the loom. And so for comfort, it really is, some people are fine reaching over like this. However, most people I do find appreciate the removable the back being removed from the loom. So yeah, so I simply had these unscrewed so that I can just lift. This is not as unscrewed as I thought. There we go. So that this beam can just be set aside, removed and set aside. Now, one of the, this now removing the beam, I think reveals something that I did. I'm not sure if you can see all the way over here or not. So this old Norwood, the original design actually did not have this screw and washer here. It merely has, and it seems like really great craftsmanship, it has this upright here, stabilizing upright, has a dowel, and it was really only supposed to be poked in and not permanently secured. But the age of this loom has caused it to get a little bit, warped perhaps, a little bit out of alignment. And so I found that these were popping out when I went to try and use the loom for the first time, or have my student use the loom for the first time. So a simple fix, I feel, is this washer and screw. Now, again, if you want it to look more age appropriate, you can oxidize these so that they're blackened. But anyway, so that's one great thing. Okay, so then the next thing we have is this warp beam with all these pegs sticking out. I mean, I'm already, just by removing the back beam, I'm already in a better position for threading these huddles. As you can see, they're already threaded. But what makes it even better is to remove the warp beam entirely. And so you can get really up close and personal when you are threading the huddles. So the loom, let me roll this down a little bit. You can see this, let me go a little bit further. You can see now I have replaced it with a bright shiny new bolt here. Typically there is a bolt, there's this fork and this bolt, and it typically would have a wing nut. Maybe the bolt would be upside down and the wing nut on top, or you know, it would be on the other side. But I've noticed over the years with all of the different Norwoods that I've had in my studio that gravity holds this pin down, this bolt down just fine. And so I don't even bother anymore screwing anything to secure the bolt with this fork. So it is something I can easily pull out. I'm going to do that. There's one on each side. Excuse me. So I've got my two bolts. And then what you can do is push your little brake release here and remove your warp beam. So that immediately, and I am sitting in an office chair that is able to be lowered down to the ground, is, you know, pretty low. And now I'm not quite eye level with the huddles, not quite. When I look through here, the threads are actually, let me change the angle. The threads are actually up here. One design feature that I've noticed with Norwoods is that the eyes of the huddles are usually a couple inches below the bottom of the reed or the shuttle race. So what you can do is you can actually, and I've also seen, you could actually put a book. You could put a book under here, a little bit of dust on this old girl. You could actually put a book or a prop under here to hold the eyes of the huddles, even with how they're coming out of the reed. And that makes it much easier on your back, your whole body. It just makes it easier on your body and your vision. And I feel like you'll be maybe less inclined to make a threading mistake. So because we have the whole warp beam off, as you're threading, come up with some, you're just reaching through and you're grabbing your threads from the reed and the loom love straight paths, as I mentioned earlier. And so your goal is always to provide the straightest possible path that you can for these threads. And if that means that you need to release the little clips, top and bottom, that hold the rails and allow yourself to shimmy the huddles back and forth into an alignment that allows for the threads to be straight, then that is in your best interest. But do remember to hook them back up again, because on looms this wide, this is a flexible, it gets to be so flexible that it can pop out if you forget to do that when you proceed to the step of winding onto the loom. So since my student has completed all of the threading, what would be the next step on this Norwood loom? The next step would be to put that warp beam right back on the loom. So the next step towards your front to back loom dressing on this loom would be to put the warp beam back on this loom. And so it's just a reverse process of the one you used to remove it, except you're going to start over here where the brake is. You're going to operate, push down that little brake thing. Now I find that having the beam turned so that the fork is going in, or what I'm trying to say is that you don't put it in with the pins with the sectional pointing at the huddles, but rather give it a little bit of a turn so that the empty gap is actually there. And so that makes it easier to get it into the fork on the right hand side. So make sure that your brake is back engaged with the gear, and then those two pins that we pulled out get reinstalled. They just get dropped in. You might have to wiggle it a little bit. Okay, and then we grab our back beam and reinstall your back beam. And so when you have an older loom, you do want to notice whether there's a good side, what the good side, right side, correct side is. Sometimes there might be a little bit of warping that has happened over its lifetime. And so you might find that it prefers to go back on the loom one direction. So you can put a little pencil mark or something in an inconspicuous spot just to help you remember. And so then again, I'm planning to replace these with shorter screws, but I would just basically screw these in a little bit. You know, I'm gonna definitely have a way shorter screw so that I do not want these heads popping up like this. Of course, if these are popping up, you're gonna do a multitude of things like catch your clothing on it, catch your skin on it, catch your warp on it. So you ideally don't want to leave these sticking out. You ideally, if you do want to use this technique of removing the back beam, then I would highly suggest a shorter bolt that will be flush and also screwed into the little nut that's inside there. So then we need to bring the warp apron rod. Now I'm going to have to operate my brake release over here and pull this apron rod. Now this goes back to if you are in fact replacing, if you own a loom like this and are replacing the apron strings with this mini blind cord, you want the rod to reach to within a couple inches of your huddles. That will be your loom waist maximum position. The loom just stops, the shafts just stop operating well when this rod is, the closer it gets to the huddles, then you know you're out of warp basically. But you do want to get as much length out of your warp or use out of your warp as possible, or reduce your loom waist as best you can. So then the next thing on this, incidentally, my suggestion when you're threading your huddles is to maybe only have about 18 inches coming from the reed. That seems to be a nice healthy amount. Anything longer is a little bit more challenging to manage in this next step. None of it's failure, but you also want your ends as you're threading to be matched up to one another. But 18 inches is what I typically, 18, 17. Anything longer than that, you're working harder. It's more frustrating than it needs to be for you. So when my student comes in this morning, and she is expected, then she is going to begin in the center. Now you could, if you wanted to, tie a string to your huddle rail, to a huddle rail, and to this rod on the left and the right to support it, because I always am preferring to begin in the center. I wouldn't actually tie warp threads to the left and right first, because they are not anchored on the other side of the reed, right? So they could continue to get slack and get pulled depending on what your rod is, how heavy your rod is. Some looms I use conduit. I replace it with a piece of conduit, which is really heavy. And so if you're going to temporarily secure it, I would do that with a separate piece of string, or like some people might maybe have some of that nylon buttonhole cord. At any rate, I do, though, find my hands fit best when I start in the center and then I go left, right, until all of my warp bundles are secured to this rod. So I untied, we do slip knots. And you might say, well, what difference does it make? I don't know what a slip knot is. I don't know the difference between a slip knot and overhand knot. Well, the slip knot is the one that has this loop in it, and it is one that when you pull the little tails, it comes out really well. So if you need to learn how to do a slip knot, it's helpful. It's not a failed situation. It's just something that is a little bit helpful for you to have the easiest, have a little bit faster setup time, right? So I untied that. I reviewed that the ends are all within, a smidgen of an inch of each other. You don't want really long. You don't want a thread that's 2 inches longer than all the rest. Because honestly, if you have one thread that's pulled, or you're using 2 inches more in this knot that I'm about to make, then you are going to end up needing to cut all of your threads. By the time you've wound this onto the loom and get to the other end of your chain, your warp chain, you're going to have to lose 2 inches from every single thread. And that's, it's just simply a wasteful thing. It shortens the potential that your warp has, but it ends up being wasteful because it just needs to get cut off. Because everybody is going to march to the same, has to be matched up to basically the same length as your shortest warp thread. At any rate, these are all within tolerance. And then the other thing I'm doing, since these were kind of dangling here from last week, I'm noticing whether there's a straight path. Again, it's in your best interest, it's in my best interest to have, to maintain straight paths whenever possible. You might say, well, what's the difference? They're all the same color. The difference is that if you have threads that are wrapped around each other, it reduces the amount of warp that you will be able to actually use. And so because it restricts, when you're at the end of your project, once this rod gets closer, doesn't matter that your rod can reach the huddles. If they are twisted around each other, the shafts won't separate, the threads won't separate nicely. So anything you can do to maintain straight paths is in your best interest. So, so I allow 7 inches for tying on knots to the apron rod. And, in the scheme of things, 7 inches is not as wasteful or as much as some people make it out to be. So, if you do the math on it, if you truly have 7 inches, if you do the math on it, you'll see that it's not as significant. The wider your project is, the more of it you have, certainly. But in the scheme of things, it's not a significant loss. And also, I'm an advocate of saving thrums, not throwing them out, and finding other useful purposes. So I'm really an advocate of utilizing that loom waste, either in the fringe on a project, attached to the fringe. That's one way of utilizing it, or utilizing it in other weave structures. I do a technique called thrumery, where I weave with thrums. We call those thrums, weaver's thrums. So I aim for a straight path, what's coming out of the reed. Now I would still have that book under these shafts holding it up at this stage, but I can adjust this rod. I allowed 7 inches. The rod, it's good that the rod can go all the way up to the huddles, but for the tie-on, I am looking at this 18-inch amount that I'm working with and eyeballing the 7 inches I allowed for the tie-on, and so I adjusted my apron rod to be at the nice position to not use more than 7 inches to compensate. This is the thing that can be adjusted, so adjust this. Let the threads be as they are. I dropped it around the rod, it's underneath, and then I'm going to bring a portion, roughly half of the threads up on the right hand side, and I actually see that I have more than 7 inches that is going into this knot, so I'm going to adjust this apron rod further. It is pulling a little bit through the reed, and so then I do a double knot. Then I will go to the right. I have my slip knot, and then I untwist it. I make sure that it looks like I have my straight path, and I aim. I might need to kind of scooch the huddles over, but I aim. Now, if I'm faced with a choice between to the left of this knot, this apron tie, I look at what provides the straightest path for my threads. If it looks truly like it wants to be centered on this apron cord, honestly, I will move it over. If it's actually looking like it's it could be over to the right, this can be managed being slightly offset on your apron rod, more so than I want my warp threads. So I scooched it over to the right a little bit so that my warp threads are actually to the left of it. And then I wrapped it around, brought up on both sides, and tie my knot. And I would just continue that way until all of the threads are secured to the apron rod. And once that is accomplished, you are indeed ready to wind your warp onto your loom. And so here is my authentic crank. So it is a removable crank on these looms. It has a square fitting. Sometimes by the time you have, it's surprising actually that this is still with this loom. I'm very grateful that it is, because these are not cheap to replace, let me tell you. But there are two things. Number one, you can simply, if you don't have your original crank, you can still use this loom. You can just turn it by hand. You can just twist the warp beam and crank it. Obviously you need to turn it in the clicking direction. In this case, it is a clockwise. If I was standing on the crank side of the crank pin side of the warp beam right now, this loom is winding on in a clockwise direction, that way, over to the right, and it makes that clicking noise every time you start to wind on. What you will have to watch out for if you have the sectional beam, whether you have a different model loom than a Norwood, this Norwood with its sectional, what you do have to watch out for as you begin to wind on is that that threads don't actually land on the end of the peg. So every single time one of these paddles with pegs engages in with the yarn, I review back here and I tweak. I just pop it off of that peg and make sure that I don't put any revolutions on my warp beam with threads sitting on top of these pegs. So that pretty much concludes. Like I said, this is not a video about loom dressing. It is about catering or focused on this vintage Norwood loom. And so from here on, it's really the same wind on method, you know, that you would be receiving in any weaving class you maybe take with me or take online or whatnot. It really is the same, and you just want to guide your threads onto the loom in the straightest possible path. And the front to back loom dressing, the reed, since the reed was already slayed and it's passing through these huddles, it is serving as its own rattle. You may have to make sure that the edge threads stay within the section on this. And then the other thing about this style loom, I don't typically need warp sticks. When I tie on this rod, I notice and prefer that when it's wound onto the loom, that it actually falls into one of these gappy areas. So then it actually, by the time it wraps around, it actually is recessed below the wind on line. So even all of these bulky knots do not interfere with winding on a good tension on this loom. Occasionally, maybe I will use a stick, and then it's just kind of like a balancing act. I kind of rest it up against the sectional pins. It will be a little wider than the little bit of margin that's here, but if I'm dropping it in, if I feel for some reason that I want a little bit more uniformity in the revolution that's about to pass over it, then I will wait until it's on the back side, and then gravity will hold it in, and then I wind through. And then when you're weaving, those will just fall out as you advance your warp, just like they would on any straight beam that you would be using. So yeah, I think I already said I was ending this video, and now I think I actually am. So once again, my name is Tammy with TLD Design Center and Gallery in the Chicagoland area. And I have used looms and new looms available for sale. I've got links in underneath this video. If you're on my YouTube channel, subscribe so that you get notified as I add additional videos on loom focus. And yeah, and I don't know what the future, once I get through all of the loom model tutorials, I'll see what else I think might be helpful for people. And that way, if you're subscribed, you'll be the first to know about it. If you're visiting the Chicagoland area, I have regular shop hours. I actually have two shops, one in Westmont, Illinois, and this one here in Berwyn, Illinois. And all of that information is available on my website and in the links below this video. So thanks again for joining me. And I hope you've got, if you're about to purchase a used loom like this vintage Norwood, or if you already own one, I hope it helped you a little bit. And in fact, this loom is available for sale if somebody's interested. It's a beauty. It's still a beauty. Thanks, and see you soon. Bye.